Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you truly need. When Margaret buried her husband in the frozen Montana ground, she thought her heart would never beat with hope again. Then Silas McGraw appeared at her cabin door like a force of nature itself. This mountain man wasn't asking for shelter or supplies. He was making a claim that would shock any decent woman. But the frontier has its own rules, and survival demands choices that civilized society would never understand. Margaret must decide between facing the wilderness alone or accepting an arrangement that terrifies and strangely comforts her wounded heart. Can two broken souls find healing in each other's arms? Or will the harsh mountain winter claim them? Both. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of snow across the Montana territory, and Margaret Whitmore knew she had perhaps 2 weeks before the killing frost would seal her fate. She stood at the window of her small log cabin, her weathered hands gripping the rough-hewn sill as she watched the aspen leaves dance their final golden dance. At 34, she felt ancient, worn down by 3 years of frontier life that had claimed her husband and nearly broken her spirit. Henry's grave marker stood visible from this very window, a simple wooden cross she'd carved herself with shaking hands just 6 weeks ago. The mound of earth had settled now, and she'd placed river stones around its border in a pattern that reminded her of the garden they'd planned to plant come spring. Spring that Henry would never see. The cabin felt impossibly large and terrifyingly small all at once. Large because Henry's absence echoed in every corner where his laughter once filled the space. Small because the walls seemed to press closer each night, reminding her how alone she truly was. Their nearest neighbors, the Hoffmans, lived 8 miles south through treacherous mountain terrain. The town of Clearwater lay 26 miles northeast, a full day's hard ride even in good weather. Margaret had been born in Philadelphia to a family of modest means but endless expectations. Her father, a clockmaker, had taught her to read and cipher numbers, unusual for a woman of her station. Her mother had taught her to sew, cook, and manage a household with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. Neither parent had prepared her for burying her husband's fever-ravaged body in ground so hard she'd needed to build fires to soften the earth enough for digging. She'd met Henry Whitmore at a church social when she was 28. Later than most women married, but her father had insisted she help with the family business until her younger brother came of age. Henry had been a dreamer, full of stories about the Montana territory where a man could claim land and build something lasting. His eyes had sparkled when he talked about wide-open spaces, clean air, and the chance to live free from the smoke and noise of industrial cities. "We'll have sons, Margaret," he'd whispered on their wedding night. "Strong sons who'll carry our name into the next century. We'll build something that matters, something that lasts." 3 years later, Henry lay cold beneath Montana soil, and Margaret had never quickened with child, despite their hoping and trying. The frontier had given them harsh winters, failed crops, and finally the fever that took Henry in just 4 days. She'd nursed him through delirium, held his hand as he spoke of children they'd never have, and whispered promises she couldn't keep about the life they'd planned to build together. Now she faced the brutal mathematics of survival. Her food stores would last perhaps 6 weeks if she rationed carefully. The small amount of money Henry had hidden in a coffee tin might buy supplies in town, but only if she could make the dangerous journey. Their milk cow had gone dry, and she lacked the strength to properly maintain their small herd of chickens through the winter months ahead. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship, though that terrified her enough. The worst part was the crushing loneliness that had settled over her like a heavy quilt she couldn't throw off. She talked to Henry's grave each morning, sharing her fears and plans as if he might respond. She found herself speaking aloud to the cabin walls just to hear a human voice, even her own. She'd written letters to her family back in Philadelphia, but the responses had been polite dismissals wrapped in gentle concern. Her father's health was failing. Her mother couldn't leave him. Her brother had his own young family to consider. The message was clear. Margaret had chosen this life, and she must find her own way through its consequences. The afternoon Henry died, Mrs. Hoffman had made the difficult journey to sit with Margaret through the worst of her grief. Sarah Hoffman was a sturdy woman in her 50s who'd raised 4 children on the frontier and buried one of her own. She'd spoken plainly about Margaret's situation. "You've got hard choices ahead, dear one," Sarah had said while they washed. "Henry's body for burial. This land doesn't forgive weakness, and it surely doesn't care about what's proper or expected. You'll need to think like the mountains think, about what survives, not what's comfortable." Margaret had nodded through her tears, not fully understanding what Sarah meant until the loneliness began eating at her like acid. Now she understood. The frontier stripped away the luxury of living by society's rules. Survival became the only morality that mattered. She'd heard stories, whispered among the women when the men weren't listening. Stories of widows who'd made arrangements that would shock decent people back east. A woman near Fort Benton had married her deceased husband's brother within a month of the funeral. Not for love, but because he needed someone to cook and tend children, while she needed someone to work the land and provide protection. Another widow had taken in a drifter who'd wintered with her and left come spring, but not before getting her with child she'd raise as her own. The frontier demanded sacrifices that civilized society couldn't comprehend. Margaret was lost in these dark thoughts when she heard the sound that would change everything. The steady thump of an axe biting wood. She'd learned to identify every sound in her isolated world. And this was wrong. No one should be cutting wood on her property. She moved quickly to Henry's rifle, checking that it was loaded before approaching the door. Through the gap in the logs that served as a window, she could see him. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the massive figure splitting wood beside her cabin. He worked with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times, each swing of the axe perfectly placed, each piece of wood falling precisely where he intended. Silas McGraw, even in her isolation, Margaret had heard the stories. He was a legend among the mountain men, a giant of a man who lived alone in the highest peaks, who could track anything that moved and disappear into the wilderness like smoke. Some said he'd been a soldier once. Others claimed he'd run from the law. Everyone agreed he was dangerous in ways that went far beyond his considerable size and skill. He was perhaps 40 years old, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of doorways and hands that could probably snap a man's neck without effort. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen hard use, and even at a distance she could see the easy way he moved, like a predator completely comfortable in his environment. What struck her most was his deliberate calm. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't looking around nervously. He was simply cutting wood for a woman who needed wood cut, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he belonged here. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she recognized something beneath her fear, a strange sense of relief. For the first time in 6 weeks, she wasn't completely alone. Someone else was making decisions, taking action, solving the immediate problem of her winter fuel supply. When he finished splitting the wood, Silas McGraw straightened to his full height and looked directly at her cabin. Even through the narrow window gap, Margaret felt the weight of his attention. He raised one massive hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or acknowledgement, then walked toward her door with the measured stride of someone who knew exactly what he intended to do next. Margaret set down the rifle and smoothed her skirts, though she couldn't say why. Her hands shook as she lifted the wooden latch, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe before opening it fully. Silas McGraw stood on her threshold like a mountain given human form. Up close, his size was even more impressive, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. They were deep brown, almost black, and held a kind of patient intelligence she hadn't expected. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture of respect. "I knew your husband. He was a good man who deserved better than what this land gave him." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "Mr. McGraw, I thank you for the wood. I don't know how I can repay you." Something flickered in those dark eyes, not amusement exactly, but a kind of knowing that made her pulse quicken. "I think you do know, ma'am. And I think we both understand why I'm here." The words hung between them like a challenge and a promise. Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her feet, as if she stood at the edge of a precipice with only two choices: fall or jump. "May I come in?" he asked. "We have things to discuss that shouldn't be spoken in the open air." Margaret stepped aside, and Silas McGraw entered her cabin, bringing with him the scent of pine smoke and leather, and the electric possibility that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Inside the cabin, Silas McGraw seemed to fill every available space. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was more grey than black, and his eyes swept the interior with the careful attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats and opportunities. Margaret watched him take in Henry's empty chair, the cold fireplace, the meager supplies on her shelves. "You have enough food for maybe a month," he said without preamble. "Less if the cold comes early. Your roof needs patching before the snow flies, and that chicken coop won't last the first real storm." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm managing well enough." Silas turned those dark eyes on her, and she saw something that might have been kindness mixed with brutal honesty. "No, ma'am, you're not. You're dying by degrees, and we both know it." The words hit her like a physical blow because they carried the weight of truth. She sank into Henry's chair, her hands gripping the worn armrests. "What do you want from me, Mr. McGraw?" He moved to her fireplace and began building a fire with the same efficient movements he'd used splitting wood. "I want what any man wants who's lived alone too long. I want sons to carry my name. I want a woman to share the burden of surviving in this country, and I want to know that when I die, there'll be something left of me in this world." Margaret watched flames catch and grow under his careful tending. "And what makes you think I would, that I could—" "Because you're strong enough to have come this far," Silas said, not looking at her. "Because you loved your husband, but you're practical enough to know he's gone. And because winter's coming whether we like it or not." He stood and faced her fully, and Margaret felt the full force of his presence. This was a man who'd made his way in a world that killed weaker men, who'd survived things she couldn't imagine. Yet when he spoke, his voice held none of the harshness she'd expected. "I'm not offering to marry you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not offering pretty words or promises about love. I'm offering you a chance to live through the winter, and I'm asking you to give me sons in return." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The proposition was shocking in its directness, yet she found herself considering it with the same practical calculation she'd once used to manage her father's accounts. "And if I refuse, then I'll leave you with enough split wood to last the month, and come spring I'll help bury what's left of you." The brutal honesty should have offended her, but instead she found it strangely comforting. At least he wasn't lying to her or pretending their situation was anything other than what it was, a transaction born of necessity. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Silas moved to the window and looked out at Henry's grave. "I winter here with you. I hunt, trap, make repairs, keep you fed and warm. You cook, mend, and when the time comes you carry my children. Come spring we decide whether to make the arrangement permanent or part ways." Margaret studied his profile against the window light. There was something noble in the set of his shoulders, a dignity that surprised her. "And if I don't quicken with child, then we try again the next winter, or the one after that. I'm a patient man when it comes to things that matter." She thought of Henry's dreams of sons, of the children they'd hoped for but never had. The irony wasn't lost on her that this stranger was offering to fulfill Henry's deepest wish, just not in the way either of them had imagined. "Why me?" she asked. "There are younger women in town, unmarried women who wouldn't require such an arrangement." Silas turned from the window and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before his usual composure returned. "Because you've already proven you can survive out here. Because you know what it costs to love someone and lose them, which means you understand the value of what I'm offering. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because I remember you from town, before Henry died. You had kindness in your eyes even when you were struggling. That matters to me." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire he'd built. "You've been watching me. I keep track of the people in my territory," he said simply. "It's how I stay alive. But yes, I noticed you particularly. Henry was a lucky man." The compliment, delivered without artifice or expectation, affected her more than flowery courtship words ever had. This man saw her clearly, her strengths and weaknesses, her situation and her options, and still found something worth wanting. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and they both turned toward the sound. Through the window, Margaret could see dark clouds building over the western peaks. The storm would be upon them within hours, and she hadn't yet finished banking the walls against winter drafts. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You have until the storm breaks," Silas replied. "After that, the decision makes itself." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending leaves swirling past. The windows. Margaret felt the familiar clutch of fear in her stomach, the terror of facing another mountain storm alone, of lying awake listening to the wind and wondering if the roof would hold, if the walls would keep out the killing cold. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "Henry and I tried for 3 years to have children. It may be that I can't, that I'm not able to give you what you want." Silas nodded, as if he'd already considered this possibility. "Then we'll face that when we come to it. But I've seen how you tend your garden, how you care for your animals. You have the heart of a mother, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes that matters more than anything else." The first fat raindrops began striking the windows, and Margaret made her decision. With the same deliberate care her father had taught her to use when evaluating a difficult clockwork mechanism. She looked at the facts. She couldn't survive the winter alone. Silas McGraw could keep her alive, and he was asking for something she'd already wanted to give Henry. "If I agree," she said, "what happens to Henry's memory, to what we built here?" Silas moved closer, and she caught the scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Henry built this place for you to live in, not die in. Seems to me the best way to honor his memory is to make sure his wife survives, to see another spring." Outside, the storm was building to its full fury. Inside, Margaret looked into the eyes of a man who'd just offered her something she'd almost stopped believing in. "Hope. All right," she said, the words barely audible above the rising wind. "All right, Mr. McGraw. I accept your proposition." Something changed in his expression. A tension she hadn't noticed before seemed to ease from his shoulders. He reached into his coat and withdrew a knife unlike anything she'd ever seen. The blade was perfectly balanced, the handle worn smooth by years of use, and the steel caught the firelight like captured lightning. "This belonged to my father," he said, offering it to her handle first. "And his father before him. It's seen me through more troubles than I can count. I want you to keep it as a token of our agreement and a promise that I'll keep you safe through what's coming." Margaret took the knife, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to fit naturally in her hand. The gesture felt significant, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, as if she was accepting more than just a tool, but a piece of his history and his trust. "Thank you," she said simply. Outside, the storm struck with the full fury of the mountains, wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. But inside, for the first time since Henry's death, Margaret felt truly warm. She wasn't alone anymore, And whatever came next, she would face it with someone who understood the harsh mathematics of frontier survival. Silas McGraw had just become her partner in the most fundamental transaction of all, the exchange of companionship, for the chance to see another dawn. The storm raged for 3 days, and during that time, Margaret learned more about Silas McGraw than she had about some people she'd known for years. He moved through her cabin with surprising grace for such a large man, never taking up more space than necessary, always aware of where she was and what she needed. He repaired Henry's old rifle while the wind howled outside, his massive hands working with delicate precision on the firing mechanism. Margaret watched him work by firelight, noting how he handled the weapon with the familiarity of someone who'd depended on firearms for survival. When he finished, he handed it back to her with careful instruction. "The sight's been pulling left," he said, guiding her hands to the proper grip. "Henry probably never noticed because he was used to compensating, but you need to know exactly where this shoots if you're going to depend on it." Margaret felt the warmth of his hands over hers and tried to focus on his words rather than his proximity. "I've never been much of a shot." "You will be," he said with quiet confidence. "This country doesn't give you the luxury of being helpless." On the second day, when the storm showed no signs of abating, Silas began teaching her to prepare game properly. He'd brought a brace of rabbits from his own snares, and Margaret watched him work with the focused attention of someone learning a skill that might mean the difference between life and death. "Most women know how to cook what their men bring home," he said, his knife moving with surgical precision. "But out here, you need to know how to make nothing into something, how to use every part of an animal, how to stretch supplies when the hunting's poor." Margaret found herself surprised by how much she didn't know. She'd thought 3 years of frontier life had taught her everything necessary for survival, but Henry had shouldered much of the burden without her realizing it. Silas was showing her the difference between surviving and thriving, between getting by and truly mastering her environment. "You're a good teacher," she said as she practiced the knife work he'd shown her. "Had to be," he replied. "Man living alone in the mountains either learns every skill he needs or he doesn't live long." That evening, as they sat before the fire, listening to the wind tear at the cabin walls, Margaret gathered the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Where did you come from, Mr. McGraw? I mean, before the mountains?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. "Pennsylvania. Had a wife there and a son. Boy would be about 15 now if he'd lived." Margaret felt her heart clench with understanding. "What happened?" "Cholera took them both. Summer of 32. I buried them in the morning and was riding west by afternoon. Couldn't stand to stay where everything reminded me of what I'd lost." She thought of Henry's grave just outside the window and understood the parallel. "I'm sorry for your loss. Long time ago now," Silas said. But she could hear the lie in his voice. "Time didn't heal wounds like that. It just taught you to carry them without bleeding on other people. Is that why you want sons?" she asked gently. "To replace what you lost?" Silas looked at her then, and she saw something raw and honest in his expression. "Can't replace what's gone, but a man needs to know his name will outlive him, that something of what he built will continue after he's gone. I've got skills, knowledge, ways of surviving in this country that die with me unless I pass them on." Margaret nodded, understanding more than he perhaps realized. Henry felt the same way. He used to say he wanted to build something lasting, something that would matter after we were gone. Smart man. This land's hard enough without facing it. Knowing everything you do dies with you. On the third day, the storm finally broke, leaving the world transformed by snow and ice. Silas ventured outside to check his snares and assess the damage, while Margaret worked on mending his shirt, a task that felt strangely intimate, handling fabric that smelled of pine smoke and carried the warmth of his body. When he returned, with fresh meat and the news that her roof had held solid through the worst of the weather, Margaret realized something had shifted between them. They'd moved past the awkward formality of strangers and into something that felt almost like partnership. "We'll need to get you properly outfitted before the next storm," Silas said as he prepared their midday meal. "Warmer clothes, better boots." This was just the first taste of what's coming. Margaret looked down at her worn dress and thin shoes, realizing how inadequate her clothing was for serious winter weather. "I don't have money for new things." "Don't need money. I've got credit with traders. And besides," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "if you're carrying my child come spring, you'll need proper gear to keep both of you healthy through the cold months." The mention of pregnancy sent a flutter through Margaret's stomach, part fear, part anticipation. She'd wanted children with Henry, but this felt different, more practical perhaps, but also more immediate. With Silas, there was no pretense of romance, no long courtship period. If they were going to create life together, it would happen soon. That evening, as they prepared for bed in the cabin's single room, Margaret felt the weight of their arrangement settling over her like a heavy blanket. Silas had been sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, giving her the bed and whatever privacy the small space allowed. But she knew that couldn't continue indefinitely. "Mr. McGraw," she said quietly as he arranged his bedroll, "about our arrangement. When should we?" He looked up at her, and she was grateful for the dim light that hid her burning cheeks. "When you're ready, Mrs. Whitmore, not before. What we agreed to doesn't change the fact that you're a lady deserving of respect." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration, even as she recognized the practical reality of their situation. Winter was deepening around them, and every day that passed was a day closer to the season when survival would require all their combined strength and resources. "I appreciate your patience," she said. "It's just that this is all so different from what I expected my life would become." "Expected never has much to do with what actually happens," Silas replied, "but sometimes what actually happens turns out better than what we expected. We won't know until we get there." As Margaret settled into bed and listened to Silas moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and checking the door latches, she found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't since Henry's death. For the first time in weeks, she could imagine seeing spring again, could picture herself still alive when the snow melted and the world turned green. It wasn't the future she'd planned, but it was a future nonetheless. And in a land where survival was never guaranteed, that felt like the most precious gift of all. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Margaret woke to find Silas already gone from the cabin, his bedroll neatly stored and coffee warming on the stove. She'd grown accustomed to his quiet morning routine, the way he moved through their shared space without waking her, always leaving her coffee and whatever breakfast he'd prepared. She was pulling on her heaviest shawl when she heard voices outside. Silas, speaking in low, measured tones, and another man responding with the nervous tension of someone trying not to show fear. Margaret moved to the window and felt her blood turn cold. 3 men sat on horseback near her woodpile, their faces hard and their clothes marking them as the kind of drifters who lived on the wrong side of the law. The leader, a thin man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, was leaning forward in his saddle, studying Silas with the calculating interest of a predator sizing up potential prey. Margaret reached for Henry's rifle, grateful now for Silas's patient instruction. In its use, she couldn't hear the words being spoken, but she could read the tension in Silas's posture, the way he stood with his feet planted and his hands loose at his sides. "We heard there was a widow living out here alone," the scarred man was saying, as Margaret crept closer to the door. "Thought we might offer our protection through the hard months ahead." "Mighty neighborly of you," Silas replied, his voice carrying no trace of concern. "But as you can see, the lady's already got all the protection she needs." Margaret watched the 3 men exchange glances, clearly reassessing their plans. They'd come expecting to intimidate a helpless woman, not confront a man who radiated competence and danger. Funny thing, the scarred man continued. We asked around town about this place. Nobody mentioned the widow had taken up with anybody. Makes a man wonder if maybe you're just passing through. Makes a man wonder lots of things, Silas agreed. Question is whether a man's smart enough to wonder quietly and move along, or whether he needs to learn some hard lessons about minding his own business. The threat was delivered so calmly, it took Margaret a moment to realize what she'd heard, but the three riders understood immediately. The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, and Margaret found herself holding her breath. Now, friend, the man said, no need to get unfriendly. We're just looking out for the welfare of folks living alone out here. Lots of dangerous men in these mountains. Yes, Silas said quietly. There are. Something in his tone made the horses skitter nervously. Margaret realized she was watching a masterclass in the art of controlled violence. Silas hadn't moved. A muscle hadn't raised his voice, but every man present understood that death was one wrong word away. The scarred man seemed to reach the same conclusion. Well then, he said, backing his horse a step, seems like everything's well in hand here. We'll be moving along. Good choice, Silas replied. And gentlemen, Mrs. Whitmore's under my protection now. That means she's under the protection of everyone who values my friendship and fears my displeasure. Spread the word. Margaret watched the three men ride away, noting how they kept looking back over their shoulders until they disappeared into the tree line. Only when they were completely out of sight did Silas turn toward the cabin, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. A cold readiness that spoke of violence, barely held in check. She opened the door before he could knock. Are they gone? For now. Silas stepped inside, and she could see him forcing the tension out of his shoulders. But they'll likely tell others about this place. About you. Word gets around that there's a woman living out here, and we'll have more visitors. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do? We make sure everyone knows you're not alone anymore. Silas moved to the window, his eyes scanning the trees where the men had disappeared. And we make sure you're ready to defend yourself if I'm not here. That afternoon, Silas began Margaret's education in earnest. He showed her how to load and fire the rifle quickly, how to gauge distances and compensate for wind. More importantly, he taught her when to shoot and when to hide, how to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. Most men like that are cowards at heart, he explained as they practiced behind the cabin. They prey on the weak because it's easier than facing someone who can fight back. But they're also unpredictable when cornered, which makes them dangerous in a different way. Margaret found herself thinking of her family's reaction if they could see her now, standing in the snow, learning to handle firearms like a frontier warrior. The thought should have shamed her, but instead she felt a strange sense of pride. She was becoming someone who could survive in this harsh country, someone worthy of the name she'd taken when she married Henry. I never imagined I'd be learning such things, she said, checking the rifle's load as he'd taught her. Life rarely goes according to our imaginings, Silas replied. The question is whether we adapt to what actually happens or let it break us. That evening, as they sat before the fire sharing the rabbit stew Margaret had learned to make properly, she found herself studying this man who'd become such an integral part of her daily existence. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair and highlighted the weathered lines around his eyes. He looked older than his years, but there was something timeless about his presence, as if he'd always existed exactly as he was now. Silas, she said, using his first name for the first time. What happened today? Would you really have killed those men? He looked at her over his coffee cup, and she saw no hesitation in his answer. If they'd threatened you, yes, without question or regret. The certainty in his voice should have frightened her, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced since Henry's death, true safety. This man would protect her with his life, not because of love or even affection, but because she was his now, part of what he'd claimed and sworn to defend. Thank you, she said simply. "Nothing to thank me for. A man protects what's his." Later. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she realized something had changed between them. The confrontation with the riders had crystallized what their arrangement truly meant. She wasn't just a woman Silas was helping through the winter. She was his responsibility, his to protect and provide for. And perhaps, she thought as she listened, to him moving quietly around the cabin, it was time to fully accept what that meant. The frontier demanded hard choices and practical decisions. She'd agreed to bear his children, but she'd been holding back the physical reality of that promise. Looking toward the man who'd just proven he'd kill to keep her safe, Margaret made a decision that would change everything between them. Tomorrow night, she would cross the final bridge between the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. Some promises, she realized, were meant to be kept sooner rather than later. Margaret woke the next morning to find a small, tarnished locket on the table beside her coffee cup. She picked it up with trembling fingers, noting its delicate craftsmanship and the way the silver caught the morning light, despite years of wear. When she opened it, she found a faded daguerreotype of a young woman holding a baby. Both faces, barely visible, but radiating the quiet happiness of a family portrait taken in better times. Silas was outside, splitting kindling, and Margaret watched him through the window as she held the locket. His movements were methodical, controlled, but she could see something different in his posture this morning, a vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, Margaret was still holding the locket. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and she saw him notice what she held. "That was my wife, Ellen," he said quietly, "and our boy, Thomas. He was 6 months old when that picture was taken." Margaret felt her throat tighten with understanding. They were beautiful. Ellen had the sweetest laugh you ever heard. Used to say she could make flowers grow just by smiling at them. Silas moved to the stove, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. Thomas was just starting to pull himself up to standing when the sickness took them, had his mother's eyes. She closed the locket gently, recognizing the trust he'd shown her by sharing this piece of his past. "Why are you showing me this, Silas?" Turned to face her, and she saw raw honesty in his expression. "Because last night made me realize I've been asking you to give me something without offering anything real in return. You've got a right to know who I am, where I come from, what kind of man you're trusting with your life." Margaret set the locket carefully on the table between them. "Tell me." He poured coffee for both of them before settling into the chair across from her. "I was a different man then. Had a good job working for a shipping company in Pittsburgh, nice house on a quiet street, plans for the future. Ellen and I met at church. She was the preacher's daughter, pure as morning snow and twice as beautiful." The affection in his voice when he spoke of his dead wife made Margaret's chest ache with a complicated mixture of sympathy and something that might have been jealousy. She pushed the latter feeling aside as unworthy. "We were happy," Silas continued. "Really happy in the way you don't appreciate until it's gone. Had plans to have more children, to build something lasting together. Then the cholera came through in 32. And inside of a week, I went from having everything to having nothing but graves to tend." Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. His skin was warm and calloused, marked by years of hard work and harder living. "I'm so sorry. Thought about following them," he said matter-of-factly. "Had the gun loaded and ready more than once. But something stopped me. Maybe Ellen's voice telling me that wasn't what she'd want. Maybe just stubborn pride that wouldn't let the sickness win completely." He paused, looking out the window toward the mountains that had become his home. "Packed what I could carry and headed west instead. Figured if I was going to be alone, might as well be alone somewhere that matched how I felt inside." Margaret understood that impulse completely. After Henry's death, she'd felt the pull of isolation, the desire to retreat from a world that had taken everything she valued. "How did you become—" She gestured vaguely, trying to encompass his reputation as a mountain man without sounding judgmental. Learned by necessity, Silas said. First winter nearly killed me. Didn't know enough about surviving in the high country. Met an old trapper named Dutch Morrison, who took pity on me, taught me what I needed to know. By the time Dutch died, I'd found my place in these mountains. Do you ever regret leaving civilization behind? Silas considered this carefully before answering. There are things I miss. The sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the way Ellen used to hum while she cooked. Having neighbors close enough to share troubles with. He looked at her directly. But I don't regret becoming who I am now. The mountains don't lie to you, don't make promises they can't keep. They're hard but honest, and that suits me. Margaret felt a deep recognition in his words. The frontier had changed her too, stripping away polite pretenses and social expectations until only essential truths remained. She was no longer the clockmaker's daughter, or even Henry's proper wife. She was simply Margaret, a woman doing whatever necessary to survive and perhaps even thrive. The locket, she said, why give it to me now? Because I want you to understand that what I'm offering you isn't just about surviving the winter or having children. It's about building something new from the pieces of what we've lost. Silas leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. I can't give you the kind of courtship a proper woman deserves. I can't promise you an easy life or take you away from this hard country. But I can promise you'll never face anything alone again. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. This wasn't the romantic love she'd shared with Henry, but it was something, perhaps even more valuable. The deep partnership of two people who understood loss and chose to face an uncertain future together. I have something for you too, she said, rising to retrieve Henry's family Bible from the shelf where it had sat untouched since the funeral. She opened it carefully to the page where she'd pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet. Their colors, faded now, but still recognizable as the sweet Williams and baby's breath she'd carried down the church aisle. These are from the day I married Henry, she said, touching the brittle petals gently. I kept them because I thought they'd always remind me of the happiest day of my life. But looking at them now, I realize they're not about the past anymore. They're about remembering that happiness is possible, even after loss. She closed the Bible and met Silas's eyes. I want to be your wife, not just in name, but in truth. I want to give you the sons you're hoping for, to build the kind of partnership that can survive anything this country throws at us. Something transformed in Silas's expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that might have been the beginning of real affection. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Margaret, he said, using her first name for the first. But I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never regret those words. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the cabin, warmth filled every corner, as two people who'd lost everything found the courage to hope for something new together. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the news Margaret had been both hoping for and dreading. She'd missed her monthly courses twice now, and the familiar queasiness she felt each morning left little doubt about her condition. She was carrying Silas's child. She chose to tell him on a morning when he returned from checking his trap lines with 3 fat beavers, and news that the creek was running clear and strong. He was in high spirits, talking about the repairs they'd need to make to the cabin before next winter, when she found the courage to speak. "Silas," she said, setting down the coffee she'd been unable to finish, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in his dark eyes. A slow smile spread across his weathered features, transforming his entire face. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "As sure as I can be. I'm about 2 months along, I think." Silas crossed the cabin in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she laughed despite her nervousness. When he set her down, his hands remained on her waist, and she could see wonder in his expression. "A child," he said, as if testing the words. "Ah, child." Margaret placed her hands over his, feeling the strength and warmth that had become so familiar to her. "Are you pleased?" Pleased? Silas laughed, a sound of pure joy she'd never heard from him before. Margaret, you've given me something I thought I'd never have again. I'm more than pleased. I'm grateful beyond words. That afternoon, Silas surprised her by producing a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a wooden cradle, beautifully carved and polished to a warm glow. Margaret ran her fingers over the intricate designs worked into the headboard, pine boughs and mountain flowers intertwined with careful artistry. "When did you make this?" she asked, marveling at the craftsmanship. "Been working on it for weeks," Silas admitted, actually looking embarrassed. "Hoped I'd have reason to give it to you someday." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she understood what this meant. He'd been carving a cradle for their child before he even knew she was pregnant, working by lamplight after she'd gone to sleep, pouring his hopes into every careful cut of the knife. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." As spring progressed into summer, Margaret watched her body change with a mixture of wonder and concern. She'd never carried a child before, and despite the reassurances of Mrs. Hoffman, who made the long journey to check on her twice, she worried constantly about doing something wrong. Silas, however, seemed to take to impending fatherhood with the same calm competence he brought to everything else. He researched which foods were best for pregnant women, learned about the stages of birth from a medical book he traded for in town, and began making preparations for their expanding family with methodical thoroughness. "We'll need to add a room to the cabin," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Give the child proper space to grow, and us some privacy when more little ones come along." Margaret rested her hand on her growing belly, trying to imagine the cabin filled with the sounds of children. "More little ones?" "Well," Silas said with a smile, "I did say I wanted sons, plural, and you're proving to be remarkably good at this business of carrying babies." Despite her happiness, Margaret found herself struggling with unexpected emotions as her pregnancy progressed. She felt guilty for finding joy with Silas when Henry had never lived to see her carry his child. The practical arrangement they'd begun with had evolved into something deeper. Not the passionate romance she'd shared with Henry, but a steady partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. "I dream about Henry sometimes," she confessed to Silas one night as they lay together in their shared bed. "He's holding our baby, the one we never had. When I wake up, I feel like I'm betraying both of you." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting protectively on her rounded stomach. "Henry would want you to be happy," he said finally. "Any man worth loving would want that for the woman he married. And this child—" He paused, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "This child is ours, Margaret. Yours and mine. That doesn't take anything away from what you shared with Henry." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight streaming through their window. "How did you get so wise about such things?" "Lost enough to understand what really matters," he replied simply. "Love isn't something you use up by sharing. The more you give, the more you have to give." As summer deepened, word of Margaret's pregnancy spread through the scattered community of homesteaders and trappers who made up their corner of the Montana Territory. The news was received with the kind of celebration that frontier communities reserved for life's most precious milestones: the successful creation of new life in a place where survival was never guaranteed. Mrs. Hoffman organized the women to prepare for the birth, gathering supplies and sharing knowledge passed down through generations of frontier mothers. Even the men contributed, with several neighbors arriving unannounced to help Silas expand the cabin and reinforce the roof against another harsh winter. "Folks are happy for you," Sarah Hoffman told Margaret during one of her visits. "Been worried about you out here alone, and Silas McGraw's got a good reputation among people who matter. They see this as proof that even the hardest country can't stop life from finding a way." Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. She was no longer an outsider struggling to survive. She'd become part of the community. connected to her neighbors by the shared challenges and hopes that bound frontier families together. One evening in late August, as she and Silas sat on their expanded porch watching their neighbors head home after a day of cabin raising, Margaret realized how completely her life had transformed. The frightened widow who'd faced death alone just months ago was gone, replaced by a woman who felt truly at home in this harsh and beautiful country. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words surprising her with their clarity and truth. Silas looked at her, and she saw her own surprise reflected in his expression. Neither of them had spoken of love before. Their relationship had been built on practicality and mutual need, growing into affection and partnership. But sitting there with his child growing inside her and their future spreading out like the vast Montana landscape before them, Margaret knew the words were true. "I love you too," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Didn't expect to, didn't think I could after Ellen. But you've given me back more than just hope for sons, Margaret. You've given me back the belief that tomorrow can be better than today." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, as if sealing a promise that went far beyond their original arrangement. Margaret felt the baby kick against her ribs at that moment, as if their child approved of this declaration of love that would shape the family they were creating. As night fell over the mountains and they prepared to go inside, Margaret took one last look at Henry's grave, visible in the moonlight beyond their garden. She felt no guilt now, only gratitude for the love that had brought her to this place and the new love that would carry her forward. "Thank you," she whispered to the wooden cross, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Henry or to whatever. Horse had brought Silas McGraw to her door when she needed him most. Inside the cabin, as Silas banked the fire and checked the locks, Margaret placed both hands on her belly and felt their son, somehow she was certain it would be a son, respond to her touch with vigorous movement. "Soon, little one," she murmured. "Soon you'll be here, and we'll finally be a complete family." Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, enjoying the warm September sun and the way her unborn child seemed to settle when she moved gently when she heard horses approaching. Silas was in town trading furs for winter supplies, so she felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as she dried her hands and walked around to the front of their home. Two men in dark suits sat astride horses that clearly weren't accustomed to mountain terrain. One was elderly, with silver hair and the soft look of someone who'd spent his life indoors. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and the calculating expression of a man who made his living from other people's troubles. "Mrs. Whitmore," the older man asked, dismounting with obvious difficulty. "Mrs. McGraw now," Margaret corrected, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. The two men exchanged glances, and Margaret felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "May we come in, ma'am? We have some legal matters to discuss regarding your late husband's estate." Margaret's mouth went dry. Henry had never mentioned any legal complications, but then Henry had been given to protecting her from unpleasant realities. "What kind of legal matters?" The younger man produced a leather satchel from his saddlebags. "I'm James Crawford, attorney at law from Denver. This is Mr. Elias Pemberton from the First National Bank of Colorado. We're here about some significant debts your late husband incurred before his death." "Debts?" Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Henry never said anything about debts." "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Crawford suggested, his tone professionally sympathetic but implacable. Margaret led them into the cabin, grateful that Silas had insisted on expanding their living space. The men seemed to fill the room with their presence and their ominous purpose. Crawford opened his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, consulting his papers, "your late husband, Henry Whitmore, took out a substantial loan from First National Bank in the spring of 1845 to finance improvements to this property and purchase livestock. The loan was secured by this land and all structures upon it." Margaret sank into her chair, one hand pressed to her stomach where the baby was suddenly active as if sensing her distress. "How much?" Pemberton leaned forward, his expression grave. With accumulated interest and late fees, the debt now stands at $847. The sum hit Margaret like a physical blow. $800 was more money than she'd seen in her entire life, more than most frontier families earned in several years of hard work. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "Henry would have told me about such a debt." "Men often try to shield their wives from financial difficulties," Crawford said with practiced sympathy. "Unfortunately, Mrs. McGraw, the law doesn't recognize good intentions as payment. The bank has been patient, given the circumstances of Mr. Whitmore's death and your subsequent situation. But patience has limits." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. "I don't have that kind of money. No one out here has that kind of money." "Which brings us to the purpose of our visit," Pemberton interjected. "The bank is prepared to foreclose on this property to satisfy the debt. However, given your condition and the approaching winter, we're willing to offer you alternatives." Crawford pulled out another document. "You could sign the property over to the bank voluntarily, which would allow you to remain as a tenant through the winter months for a modest rental fee. Or—" he paused, studying Margaret carefully. "We understand your current husband has some reputation in these mountains. Perhaps he could be convinced to assume the debt in exchange for clear title to the land." Margaret's mind raced. $800 was an impossible sum for someone like Silas, who lived primarily by hunting and trapping. Even his best year wouldn't generate that kind of cash money. "And if we can't pay?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Then the property will be sold at public auction in 30 days. Pemberton said matter-of-factly. "Any proceeds beyond the debt will be returned to you, of course." Margaret almost laughed at the cruel joke. Who would buy an isolated homestead in the Montana mountains? And for what price? They'd be lucky to get $100 for land and cabin that represented years of Henry's back-breaking work. "I need time to discuss this with my husband," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course," Crawford agreed, rising from his chair. "We'll be staying in Clearwater for the next few days, but Mrs. McGraw, I must stress that time is of the essence. The bank has been more than patient, and legal processes once begun can be difficult to stop." After the men left, Margaret sat alone in the cabin that suddenly felt less like home and more like borrowed space. She thought of Silas's careful improvements, the room he'd added for their coming child, the hours he'd spent making their home comfortable and secure. How could she tell him that none of it was really theirs? When Silas returned at sunset, his wagon loaded with winter supplies and his face bright with the satisfaction of successful trading, Margaret felt her heart break a little more. He'd used his own credit, his own carefully built relationships to prepare for their family's future. And now she had to destroy that future with news of Henry's hidden debts. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Silas said, immediately crossing to her side. "Are you feeling well? Is it the baby?" "Sit down," Margaret said quietly. "We need to talk." She told him everything, watching his expression grow more serious with each detail. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire he'd built against the cooling evening air. $800, he said finally. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea Henry had borrowed money. He never said anything about—" "This isn't your fault," Silas interrupted gently. "Henry was trying to build something for you, for the family you plan to have. Can't fault a man for that." Margaret felt tears burning her eyes. "But what do we do? How can we possibly—" Silas stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land they'd both come to love. "I have some money saved," he said slowly. "Maybe $200 in. Gold and silver hidden in the mountains where I used to winter alone. And my furs should bring another 100 when I finish the trading season. That's not even half of what we need." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." Margaret watched her husband's shoulders set with determination, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching night. "There is another way," he said quietly, not turning from the window. "Something I swore I'd never do again. But what are you talking about?" Silas moved to their bedroom and returned with a small wooden box Margaret had never seen before. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a military medal and a document bearing official seals. "I wasn't just any soldier before I came to the mountains," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I was a scout for the army, specialized in tracking hostile Indians and recovering stolen property. The government still owes me money, back pay and bounties I never collected because I wanted to disappear completely." Margaret stared at the medal, recognizing it as something significant, even though she couldn't read the military nomenclature. "How much money?" "Enough," Silas said simply. "More than enough to pay Henry's debts and keep this land, but collecting it means going back to a life I left behind for good reasons. It means becoming someone I swore I'd never be again." Margaret felt their unborn child kick against her ribs, as if sensing the tension in the room. She looked at this man who'd become everything to her, protector, provider, partner, and the father of her child, and realized he was prepared to sacrifice his carefully built peace for her sake. "What kind of reasons?" she asked quietly. Silas met her eyes, and she saw old pain carefully controlled. The kind that wake you up screaming in the night, the kind that make a man understand why some prices are too high to pay, no matter what you gain. Outside, night was falling over the mountains, and with it came the weight of decisions that would determine not just their immediate future, but the kind of people they would become in facing this crisis together. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, and with it a clarity that cut through Margaret's fears like winter air through wool. She'd spent the night lying awake beside Silas, listening to his carefully controlled breathing, and knowing he wasn't sleeping either. By dawn, she'd made her decision. "I want to see it," she said, as Silas built up the fire for their morning coffee. He looked at her questioningly, and she gestured toward the wooden box that still sat on their table like an accusation. "The medal, the documents. I want to understand what you're offering to sacrifice for us." Silas hesitated, then opened the box with the careful reverence of someone handling something simultaneously precious and poisonous. The medal was silver, worn smooth, in places with an eagle spread across its face, and words Margaret couldn't quite make out in the morning light. "Congressional Medal of Honor," Silas said quietly, "for actions during the Seminole campaign in Florida. I was 26 years old and stupid enough to think courage and a good cause could solve anything." Margaret lifted the medal, surprised by its weight. "What did you do?" "Led a rescue mission to recover settlers taken captive during a raid. 37 people, mostly women and children, held in a Seminole stronghold deep in the Everglades." Silas's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "Took 12 men in, brought 49 out, lost 3 of my own soldiers in the process." "That sounds like something to be proud of, does it?" Silas met her eyes, and she saw depths of pain she hadn't imagined. "Tell that to the wives of the men who died. Tell that to the Seminole families we killed to get those settlers back. War makes heroes out of men who do terrible things for necessary reasons." Margaret set the medal down gently, beginning to understand why Silas had buried this part of his past so deeply. "The government owes you money for this? Not for the medal. For what came after." Silas unfolded the official documents, his hands steady despite the emotion in his voice. "They wanted more missions, more rescues, more of whatever made that. First one successful. Kept sending me deeper into hostile territory, kept expecting miracles." He pointed to a line of figures at the bottom of one document. "Back pay, hazard compensation, bounties for recovered property and captured hostiles. Adds up to nearly $1,200, more than enough to clear Henry's debt and have money left over for improvements." Margaret felt a flutter of hope mixed with growing dread. "Then why haven't you collected it?" "Because collecting it means going back to Fort Leavenworth, submitting to military authority, answering questions about why I disappeared without leave 10 years ago." Silas refolded the documents with military precision. "Means becoming Sergeant McGraw again, instead of just Silas, the mountain man who wants to be left alone." "Would they arrest you for leaving without permission?" "Maybe. Probably depends on how much they still need men with my particular skills." Silas moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become his sanctuary. There's fighting brewing with the Plains tribes, and the army's short of experienced scouts. They might be willing to overlook desertion in exchange for service. Margaret felt their child move restlessly within her, as if responding to her elevated heartbeat. How long would you have to serve? Don't know. Could be months. Could be years. Depends on how much trouble the Lakota and Cheyenne decide to make. The thought of Silas leaving her, especially now with the baby coming soon, made Margaret's chest tighten with panic. But the thought of losing their home, of being homeless with a newborn in the Montana winter, was even worse. There has to be another way, she said desperately. What about the bank? Could we negotiate with them, arrange payments over time? Silas shook his head. Men like Pemberton don't travel this far for partial payments. They want the full amount, or they want the land. That's how banks work. They're not in the business of being patient with poor folks. Margaret spent the morning going through every option she could imagine. She wrote letters to her family back east, though she knew they had no significant money to send. She calculated the value of everything they owned, from Henry's tools to their livestock, and came up short by hundreds of dollars. That afternoon, Mrs. Hoffman arrived unexpectedly, her weathered face creased with worry. "I heard about your visitors yesterday," Sarah said without preamble, as she accepted Margaret's offer of coffee. "Word travels fast in country this sparse. Folks are concerned." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I suppose everyone knows about Henry's debts now. Don't you worry about what folks think. We've all made financial mistakes trying to build something in this country." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Margaret found herself pouring out the whole story. Silas's military background, the money the government owed him, the terrible choice between his freedom and their home. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "That man of yours," Sarah said when Margaret finished, "he's willing to go back to soldiering for your sake." "He says he is. But Sarah, you should see his face when he talks about it. Whatever happened during his military service, it changed him in ways that still cause him pain." Sarah was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and staring into the fire. "My late husband fought in the Mexican War," she said finally. "Came back different than when he left. Quieter, more careful, like he was always listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. Some men pay a higher price for their service than others. Then you understand why I can't ask Silas to do this." "Child, I understand why you don't want to ask, but sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we have to let other people make for themselves." Sarah reached across the table and patted Margaret's hand. "Your Silas isn't a man to offer something he's not prepared to follow through on." That evening, Margaret watched Silas make preparations with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything he did. He cleaned and oiled his best rifle, sorted through his clothing to find items that could pass for military regulation, and wrote careful letters to contacts he'd apparently maintained, despite his desire to disappear completely. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said as she watched him wrap his medal and documents in fresh oilcloth. "We could leave, start over somewhere else." "And go where?" Silas asked gently. "You're 7 months pregnant, Margaret. Winter's coming, and we don't have money to buy land anywhere else. This is our home. Our child deserves to be born in his own house, on his own land." Margaret felt tears threaten, hormones and fear combining into overwhelming emotion. "I'm scared, Silas. Scared of you leaving. Scared of what might happen. Scared of being alone again." Silas set aside what he was doing and pulled her into his arms, careful of her pregnant belly. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But I'm more scared of failing you, of not being the man you deserve, the father our child needs. You're already both of those things. Then trust me to keep being them, even if it means doing something I'd rather avoid." Silas kissed her forehead gently. "I'll be back, Margaret. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I'll come home to you and our son." Outside, winter wind rattled the cabin walls, reminding them both that time was running short. In 3 weeks, the bank would foreclose unless they could produce nearly $900. In 6 weeks, their child would be born. And somewhere between those two dates, Silas McGraw would have to transform himself back into the soldier he'd worked so hard to leave behind. Margaret placed her hands on her belly, feeling their child's strong kicks, and made her own silent promise. Whatever happened, whatever sacrifices were required, she would make sure their son knew the story of his father's courage, not just the battlefield heroics that had earned him medals, but the quiet bravery of a man willing to face his worst. Memories to protect the family he loved. The next morning, Silas would ride east toward Fort Leavenworth and a reckoning with his past. Margaret would remain in their cabin, guarding their future and preparing for the birth that would make them a family complete, if Silas could win back the right to call this place home. 2 weeks after Silas departed for Fort Leavenworth, Margaret was searching through Henry's old trunk for extra blankets when her fingers found something unexpected, a leather portfolio wedged beneath the trunk's false bottom. Her heart pounded as she carefully extracted the hidden compartment Henry had apparently built without telling her. Inside the portfolio, wrapped in oiled paper, was a document that made her hands tremble as she read it. The original land patent, signed by the territorial governor himself, clearly establishing Henry Whitmore as the sole legal owner of their property. But more importantly, there was a second document, a receipt from First National Bank dated 3 months before Henry's death. Margaret had to read it twice before the words made sense. Payment in full, $847. Outstanding balance, 0.00. Henry had paid off the entire debt, but somehow the bank's representatives had either failed to record the payment properly or were deliberately misrepresenting the situation. She sank into Henry's chair, clutching the documents to her chest as the implications washed over her. There was no debt. There never had been, at least not at the time of Henry's death. The bank was either mistaken or committing outright fraud. But Silas was already riding toward Fort Leavenworth, prepared to sacrifice his hard-won peace to pay a debt that didn't exist. Margaret had no way to reach him, no way to stop him from making the terrible bargain that would return him to military service. She was still sitting in the chair, staring at the receipt, when she heard horses outside. Through the window, she saw Crawford and Pemberton approaching, their faces set with the grim satisfaction of men coming to collect on a debt. Margaret met them at the door, the documents clutched in her hand like weapons. "Gentlemen," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "I was hoping you'd return. I have something to show you." Crawford dismounted with his usual difficulty. "Mrs. McGraw, I hope you've reconsidered our generous offer. Time is running short, and the bank's patience is about to be tested," Margaret interrupted, holding up the receipt. "This document shows that my late husband paid off his debt in full 3 months before his death. Either your records are seriously in error, or you're attempting to defraud me." Both men went very still. Pemberton's face flushed red, while Crawford's expression became carefully neutral, the look of a lawyer who'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. "That's impossible," Pemberton blustered. "Our records clearly show—" "Your records are wrong," Margaret said firmly. "This is an official receipt bearing your bank's seal and signature. Unless you're claiming your own institution is issuing fraudulent documents." Crawford stepped forward, extending his hand. "May I examine that receipt, Mrs. McGraw?" Margaret had expected this request and was ready for it. "Certainly, but I'll be keeping the original safely in my possession. You may look, but not touch." She held the document at reading distance, watching Crawford's face as he took in every detail. She saw the exact moment when he realized the receipt was genuine. His confident expression faltered, replaced by something that might have been concern or calculation. "This appears to be authentic," he admitted reluctantly, "but I'm afraid There might be some confusion about the timing. No confusion, Margaret interrupted. The date is clear, the amount is exact, and the signature matches other bank documents in my husband's files. Henry paid his debt in full, which means this land belongs to me, free and clear. Pemberton had recovered his composure and now stepped forward with renewed bluster. Even if this document is legitimate, there are other considerations. Interest, penalties, administrative fees, which would be clearly noted on the receipt if they applied. Margaret shot back. This document states payment in full and outstanding balance 0. There's no ambiguity. She watched the two men exchange glances, clearly communicating without words. These were men accustomed to intimidating widows and homesteaders who lacked the education or resources to challenge their claims. They hadn't expected to encounter someone who could read legal documents and wasn't afraid to stand her ground. Mrs. McGraw, Crawford said carefully, even if there has been some clerical error regarding your husband's account, the fact remains that you're living on land that the bank has certain claims upon. The bank has no claims, Margaret stated flatly. And if you continue to assert otherwise, I'll be forced to take this matter to the territorial authorities. I'm certain they'll be very interested to learn about a Denver bank attempting to foreclose on property that was paid for in full. The threat hit its mark. Both men knew that frontier justice had little patience for financial institutions that preyed on settlers, especially pregnant women trying to make honest lives in harsh country. Perhaps we should return to Denver and review our records more carefully, Crawford said after a long pause. It's possible there has been some administrative oversight. I think that would be wise, Margaret agreed. And gentlemen, I'll be writing to the territorial governor about this matter, just to ensure there are no future oversights regarding my property. As she watched the two men ride away, Margaret felt a fierce pride in her own strength. She'd faced down men who'd tried to steal her home, and she'd done it without Silas's protection or anyone else's help. Now she just had to pray that her husband would return home safely, and that their child would be born into a future as secure. As she'd just made it, Margaret went into labor on a Tuesday morning in early November, 3 weeks after the confrontation with the bank representatives, and with still no word from Silas. Mrs. Hoffman had moved into the cabin the week before, sensing that the birth was imminent and unwilling to leave Margaret alone for such a critical time. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient, Sarah said, as Margaret gripped the bedpost through another contraction. And this little one seems eager to meet the world. Margaret had imagined this moment countless times during her pregnancy, but she'd always pictured Silas holding her hand, whispering encouragement, sharing the joy and terror of bringing their child into the world. Instead, she faced the most important moment of her life without knowing if her husband was alive or dead, free or imprisoned, coming home or lost to her forever. I need him here, she gasped between contractions. I need Silas. I know, dear. Fun, Sarah soothed, pressing a cool cloth to Margaret's forehead. But right now, your baby needs you to be strong. You've got everything inside you that's required for this. Women have been birthing babies without their men for as long as there have been wars and wandering. The labor progressed through the day, with the relentless rhythm that Sarah assured her was normal. Margaret found herself thinking of her own mother, who'd brought 6 children into the world in the back room of their Philadelphia home. She thought of Ellen McGraw, Silas's first wife, who died giving birth to the son Silas had lost. She thought of all the frontier women who'd faced this moment with only their own strength and the help of other women who understood the ancient mystery of birth. As evening approached and the contractions grew stronger, Margaret heard something that made her heart leap, the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. Sarah heard it too and moved quickly to the window. It's a rider, she announced, coming fast. Could be... Margaret cried out as another contraction gripped her, and Sarah hurried back to her side. Don't you worry about what's happening outside. You've got work to do right here. But Margaret could hear voices now, Silas's deep rumble and another man's higher tones. Relief flooded through her so intensely that she actually laughed through her pain. "He's home," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, he's home." The cabin door opened, and Silas filled the doorway, still dressed in travel clothes and looking like he'd ridden hard for days without rest. His eyes found Margaret immediately, and she saw relief and love and fierce protectiveness in his expression. "How is she?" he asked Sarah, moving to Margaret's side with the careful urgency of someone trying not to panic. "She's doing exactly what she needs to do," Sarah replied firmly, "and this baby's ready to make its appearance any moment now. You got here just in time." Silas took Margaret's hand, and she felt the familiar strength and warmth that had sustained her through every challenge they'd faced together. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "I tried to get back sooner, but—" "You're here now," Margaret interrupted, gripping his hand as another contraction began. "That's all that matters. The bank, the debt, I got the money, but later," Sarah commanded with the authority of someone who'd attended dozens of births. "Right now, your wife needs all her strength for bringing your son into the world." The final stage of labor came with surprising swiftness. Margaret felt her body take over completely, driven by instincts, older than civilization, stronger than fear. With Silas holding one hand and Sarah coaching her through each push, she brought their child into the world, just as the sun set over the Montana mountains. The baby's first cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant and absolutely perfect. Sarah worked quickly, cleaning and examining the infant, while Margaret and Silas watched in wonder. "It's a boy," Sarah announced with satisfaction, wrapping the baby in the soft blankets Margaret had prepared months ago. Strong and healthy, with his father's lungs and his mother's determination. She placed the baby in Margaret's arms, and Margaret felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Their son was perfect, tiny but vigorous, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at her with ancient wisdom. "He's beautiful," Silas whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. "Margaret, he's perfect." Their son immediately grasped Silas's finger with surprising strength, holding on as if he understood that this man was his father, his protector, the one who would teach him to survive and thrive in this challenging world. "What will you name him?" Sarah asked, gathering up the birthing linens with efficient satisfaction. Margaret looked at her husband, seeing exhaustion and joy and overwhelming love in his weathered features. "Henry Silas McGraw," she said without hesitation, "to honor the man who brought me to this place and the man who made this moment possible." Silas's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "Henry Silas McGraw," he repeated softly, testing the sound of their son's name. "Welcome home, son." Outside, winter wind began to blow, but inside their cabin, a new family was complete at last. Spring returned to the Montana territory with unusual warmth, and Margaret found herself sitting on the expanded porch of their cabin, watching 6-month-old Henry Silas McGraw discover the fascinating world of his own hands. Their son lay on a soft blanket she'd sewn during the long winter months, gurgling contentedly in the morning sunshine, while his parents shared coffee and the quiet satisfaction of another harsh season successfully survived. "He's going to be walking before we know it," Silas observed, watching their son kick his legs with determined vigor. "Look at those muscles." Margaret smiled, remembering her fears during pregnancy about whether she could love a child born of such practical circumstances. Those worries seemed foolish now, as she watched Henry grab his father's finger with the same fierce grip he'd shown at birth. Love, she'd learned, didn't require perfect conditions or romantic beginnings. It simply required two hearts willing to open themselves to the possibility of caring for another person completely. "Tell me again about Fort Leavenworth," she said, settling more comfortably against Silas's shoulder. "You never finished the story." Silas was quiet for a moment, watching their son with the wonder that still seemed to surprise him every morning. Wasn't much of a story, really. Rode up to the gates expecting to face a court-martial and found out the army was so desperate for experienced scouts they were willing to overlook almost anything. Colonel Morrison remembered me from the Seminole campaigns, said I was the best tracker he'd ever worked with, and they just gave you the money. Eventually, had to fill out forms, submit to interviews, prove I was who I claimed to be. Military bureaucracy moves slower than winter molasses. Silas chuckled, shaking his head at the memory. Spent 3 weeks in officers' quarters, answering the same questions over and over, while clerks shuffled papers and tried to figure out how to process a ghost who'd wandered back into official existence. Margaret thought about those 3 weeks, about the fear and uncertainty she'd lived with while caring for their newborn son and wondering if Silas would ever return. You never considered staying, taking them up on their offer? For about 5 minutes, Silas admitted. The pay was good, and they made it clear I could have my pick of assignments. But then I thought about you and Henry waiting here, about the life we were building together, and realized I'd already found everything I was looking for. Their son chose that moment to let out a demanding cry, and Margaret lifted him from his blanket, settling him against her shoulder, where he immediately quieted. At 6 months, Henry was already showing signs of his father's calm temperament, mixed with his mother's practical intelligence. He studied the world around him with serious, dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Mrs. Hoffman thinks he'll be talking early," Margaret said, feeling the solid weight of their child against her chest. "Says he watches people's mouths too carefully when they speak." "Smart boy," Silas said with obvious pride. "Takes after his mother." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their peaceful morning, and Margaret felt the familiar flutter of nervous alertness that still came whenever strangers appeared at their isolated home. But these riders were neighbors, the Hoffmans, the Carlsons, and several other families from their scattered community. "Looks like we're having company," Silas observed, rising to meet their visitors. What followed was one of the spontaneous gatherings that made frontier life bearable despite its hardships. Sarah Hoffman had brought fresh bread and news from town. Tom Carlson had questions about the best spots for summer hunting. The younger children played together while adults shared coffee and conversation on the expanded porch that Silas had built to accommodate such gatherings. "You two have become quite the success story," Sarah told Margaret, as they watched their menfolk discussing the prospects for the coming harvest. "Word's gotten around about how you faced down those bankmen, and about Silas getting his army. Money sorted out. Folks are saying it proves this country doesn't have to break a person if they're strong enough and smart enough to fight back." Margaret looked around at their neighbors, at her husband holding their son, while discussing practical matters with other fathers, at the cabin that had grown from desperate shelter into a true home. "I never expected to find such happiness here," she said quietly. "When Henry died, I thought my life was over. I certainly never imagined I'd end up with a family and a place in a community like this." "Life has a way of surprising us," Sarah agreed. "The trick is being ready to recognize happiness when it shows up wearing work clothes instead of fancy dress." As evening approached and their neighbors prepared to head home, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the frightened widow who'd nearly died of loneliness and despair, about the desperate bargain that had seemed like her only chance at survival, about the gradual transformation of necessity into partnership and finally into love. Henry's grave was still visible from their porch, the wooden cross now weathered, but still standing as a reminder of the love that had brought her to this place. But it no longer felt like a reproach or a source of guilt. Instead, it had become part of the landscape of their life together, a testament to the idea that love could take many forms and that sometimes the end of one dream could be the beginning of another. As Silas settled their son into the beautiful wooden cradle for his evening sleep, Margaret realized that her story had come full circle. She'd begun as a woman who'd lost everything and found herself with nothing but impossible choices. Now she was a woman who'd built something lasting with a man who understood that survival and love weren't opposites, but partners in the endless dance of making a life worth living. Their son's first blanket, hand-sewn during the long winter nights, covered him now as he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the security of parents who'd learned that the strongest foundations weren't built on romance or convenience, but on the steady accumulation of shared challenges met and overcome together. Outside their cabin, night settled over the Montana mountains with the promise of another day to come. Inside, 3 people who'd become a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. Sometimes, Margaret reflected in the moments before sleep claimed her, the best stories were the ones that began with endings and found their way to new beginnings, through the simple courage of people willing to hope for something better than what they'd lost.